It's an honor to be in the chamber once again, and I'm pleased to rise on Bill S6. The stated purpose of this bill, Madam Speaker, is to reduce administrative burdens for businesses and to facilitate digital interactions with government, to simplify regulatory processes, make exemptions from certain regulatory requirements to test new products, and make cross-border trade easier through more consistent and coherent rules across governments. The proposed measures were a result of, I'm told, a public consultation by the Treasury Board Secretariat, as well as a call out to federal departments on what changes they require to further streamline the regulatory process. The Regulatory Modernization Bill is instituted, and I believe for the first time this year, to optimize regulatory processes between departments. This is the second Regulatory Modernization Bill, with the first instance of this legislation being introduced in 2019 under the Budget Implementation Act. The stated purpose of this legislation is to reduce administrative burdens for businesses, facilitate digital interactions with government, to simplify regulatory processes, and make exemptions from certain regulatory requirements to test new products, and again, to make cross-border trade easier. In all, Bill S6 proposes 46 minor changes to 29 acts that are administered by the following 12 organizations: the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Canada Border Service Agencies, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, Health Canada, Transport Canada, and Parks Canada. Bill S6 thank you. Bill S6 would remove, the first one would remove the requirement that the notice of bankruptcy be published in a local newspaper and allow the superintendent of bankruptcy to issue directives regarding how the notice will be published. That's actually a pretty interesting regulation, Madam Speaker. I can't remember the last time I saw an advertisement in the Abbotsford News, the Mission City Record, or the Ashcroft-Cache Creek Journal outlining that someone was bankrupt. I think I might even follow up with a question to the Library of Parliament to see the last time this regulation was used. Perhaps in the 21st century economy, we can outline people's bankruptcies over Facebook. The second regulation Bill S6 seeks to amend would be allow an application for mediation to be withdrawn and for the trustee to proceed with an automatic discharge of the bankrupt where an agreement had been breached between the trustee and the bankrupt before a scheduled mediation. The third change this bill would bring into effect would be to make changes to the Weights and Measures Act to provide a temporary permission mechanism, allowing the minister to permit temporary permissions for devices for use in trade, set terms and conditions, and would allow the minister to revoke such a permission. The next regulation this bill deals with is to repeal the regulation making authority related to the requirement for contact information on vending machines that dispenses liquids. Oh my goodness. The next one is to repeal the requirement for dealers and traders to notify Measurement Canada when they import a measuring device for use in their business. I guess with the onset of Amazon and the ease at which we can find scale these days, it's probably a good regulation to repeal. The next regulation would be to revise the coming into force date for recent amendments to the Act in 2018's Budget Implementation Act. The next one would be to change the term annual return to a term that is less confusing for stakeholders. I'm not quite sure what bill that would refer to exactly. Bill S6 would update language pertaining to the handling of hazardous products in the workplace to ensure alignment with the Hazardous Products Act. What's interesting is I would be remiss if I did not mention another government bill coming from the Senate, the Independent Senate Group again, on SEPA, in how changes to the Hazardous Products Act may intertwine with the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The next area of regulation this bill seeks to change is to amend the Agricultural Products Marketing Act to simplify the regulatory system for provincial agricultural marketing boards. I look forward to hearing from government members how, in fact, by simplifying the regulatory system for provincial agricultural marketing boards, we might see more local produce in our grocery stores. Madam Speaker, I come from a riding with the highest farm gate sales per capita in Canada, and there's broad unanimity amongst my constituents and in my riding that we need to see more local produce on the shelves. After the floods last year, this was of particular concern because many of the prime blueberry fields in the province were flooded out when the Nooksack River in Washington State washed away the agricultural lands on Sumas Prairie. So I look forward to seeing how the minister will enact such regulations to improve the way local produce is marketed in Canada. The next regulation is to amend the Health of Animals Act to enable the minister to approve a program elaborated by a third party for the purposes of preventing the introduction of any vector, disease, or toxic substance, or for controlling, eradicating, or preventing the spread of vectors, diseases, and toxic substances. Similar to this amendment to the Health of Animals Act, earlier this week in Parliament we debated the member from Foothills Private Members Bill, which also talked about the Health of Animals Act in the context of biosecurity on farms and the challenges that many agricultural producers are facing in respect to the avian flu and other diseases which are impacting agricultural sectors. I will note, Madam Speaker, that in the United States, due to the fact that maybe perhaps their biosecurity provisions on agricultural properties and under the Health of Animals Act wasn't as robust perhaps as we have it in Canada, led to a massive increase in poultry prices and the destruction of hundreds of thousands of birds meant for consumption. So I'm happy to see this amendment to ensure that we do the best to protect our farmers and our consumers consuming their food. Another amendment in Bill S6 also touches upon the Health of Animals Act to enable the minister to make an interim order that may be used when immediate action is required to deal with a significant risk to protect animal and human health and the environment. I think this is a good sense regulation that speaks to my previous point that we need to give the Canadian Food Inspection Agency the tools they need when there is another case of avian flu or another disease impacting our agricultural products like foot and mouth disease, which has also impacted production in the Fraser Valley at previous times. The next amendment in Bill S6 makes changes to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency Act, which would allow the agency to deliver services and businesses to interact with CFIA through electronic means rather than having to rely solely on paper-based transactions. This change would reduce administrative burden for businesses and allow them greater flexibility in their interactions with government. Madam Speaker, anytime any government agency is taking a step forward to digitize their interactions with Canadians, I think that's a positive step. You know, myself and the member of Kingston had a debate a few months ago about the immigration services that MPs provide in our constituency offices, and we both agreed that sometimes we take on too much of this work on behalf of public servants. And in many cases, the constituents who come to my office and they talk about their interactions with citizenship and immigration always decry the fact that so much of what they have to do is still based on paper forms that are anachronistic. So I'm happy that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is making these relevant regulatory changes to allow people to communicate by email in the 21st century. That's a good change. The next regulation in S6 I'd like to discuss is to amend the Safe Food for Canadians Act to amend the definition of food commodity to align with the definition of food in the Food and Drugs Act as amended in 2019. The next one is to provide authority to make regulations as a result of Canada entering into a free trade agreement. I think this specific regulation, we won't know the context of it until it's enacted and put into practice by the Minister of Trade upon this bill hopefully receiving royal assent, Madam Speaker. There are a number of amendments related to the Canada Transportation Act to enable new mechanisms to be used to integrate regulatory changes stemming more quickly from updates to international transportation safety standards. This would ensure that our transportation sectors meet the most up-to-date safety standards and keep pace with changes in technology and innovation. Madam Speaker, Abbotsford is home to Cascade Aerospace. I was actually able to speak on a concurrence motion to a regulatory change that might be covered in Bill S6, and that was the fact that when students are learning or taking the test to be an airplane mechanic or to work in the aviation sector, the training manuals still require students in the 21st century to go through a module on cloth wings. I don't think there are many planes in Canada made with cloth any longer. Cascade Aerospace specifically said that Canada and the aerospace industry at large has asked for many years that Canada's regulatory process be more in line with the FAA in the United States to stay competitive and allow for companies like Cascade to bid on contracts with American companies to provide the types of manufacturing and high-tech jobs we're looking for in Canada. So hopefully this regulation to the Transportation Act will help us get there. The next regulation would be to revise the Electricity and Gas Inspection Act to broaden the type of sampling that could be used as the basis for verification or re-verification of meters beyond only statistical sampling. The next one would be to make changes to the Canada Petroleum Resources Act and the Canada Oil and Gas Operations Act to provide flexibilities to update regulations for miscellaneous technical or administrative changes. The next regulation would be to make changes to the Canada Land Surveyors Act to modernize the legislative framework that regulates the Canada Land Surveyors profession. On this side of the House, Madam Speaker, we've been speaking a lot about the designation of skilled workers in Canada. Hopefully this is a positive change that will allow more immigrants, for example, to work as surveyors in our communities. Like many professions, we're seeing a shortage of workers, especially in skilled fields such as this one. Hopefully this regulation will encourage more people to become surveyors in Canada and do the necessary work to build our roads and prepare neighborhoods for development as we look to see more housing construction in Canada. In fact, I just had to hire a surveyor recently in Abbotsford for my own house, and I was very pleased with the service they provided. But due to the shortage of workers, I couldn't believe the bill I had to pay at the end. But hey, that's a debate for another time, Madam Speaker. But let me just conclude a bit with looking over some of the remarks made by Senator Wu, who sponsored this bill on behalf of the government. Now, Senator Wu is one of 5 senators from the province of BC. When he sponsored this bill, Madam Speaker, I almost felt he was a member of the Liberal government. He talked about looking ahead, that the Treasury Board Secretariat would be considering more proposals for another regulatory modernization bill. And he talked about his close working relationship with the Treasury Board Secretariat as if he wasn't independent but a member of the Liberal government. This is particularly challenging for me, Madam Speaker, because one, I actually think this bill is really, really important, and it's doing a lot of things that stakeholders and deputy ministers across the government of Canada have been asking for a long time, and that's just to clean up the balance sheet, so to speak, so government can function more effectively on behalf of Canadians and provide us the services that we collectively need and the regulation that's required to run different sectors of our economy and our consumption of goods and produce. But Madam Speaker, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that it was hard for me to see that it was the government not tabling this directly in the House of Commons, but going through the Senate. British Columbia right now has a population just over 5 million people. That means for every senator we have, they represent effectively 1 million people, Madam Speaker. In Ontario, it's not much better. It's at 592,000. And on Prince Edward Island, it's 38,000. Madam Speaker, the government shouldn't be doing its important work through their Liberal senators in the other chamber. They should be doing the important work here in the chamber. And Madam Speaker, going back to the Senate, as a British Columbian, I hope one day that we have a more effective voice in Canadian Confederation. You know, when I go door knocking during elections, it doesn't matter. Almost every day, someone's going to raise the fact that Ottawa doesn't adequately represent the interests of my province, largely due to the fact that we only have 6 senators allotted to us, 5 in place right now, and we pay equalization payments to other provinces, and we have the 3rd highest population. Madam Speaker, in the years ahead, Indigenous people are going to take more control of their life through natural resource development. There are a number of amazing companies that are partnering with Indigenous people in the natural resources sector, and I am very optimistic about trade and commerce on Canada's West Coast in the years ahead. And I hope by the economic growth that we're going to see that is going to drive the Canadian economic growth in the 21st century, that one day, Madam Speaker, we're going to have a sufficient number of senators or equal representation in Ottawa, because British Columbians deserve it, Madam Speaker. Thank you for your time tonight.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Well, Madam Speaker, if the member wants to understand why certain provinces such as PEI have various different representations in the Senate, he should probably just pick up the Constitution and have a look at that, and perhaps that'll help to inform him on that. To be honest, his discussion at the end there, the last 30 or 45 seconds, was probably the most passionate of his entire 20-minute speech. He seemed to speak a lot about, how much he's in favor of the bill, I guess, and rhetorically speaking about the need or lack of need for a lot of the regulations. So Conservative after Conservative have indicated their support for this, Madam Speaker. So I'm wondering if the member can inform the House as to when we might be able to get on with this and vote on this, and if he could do that in at the same time sparing me the rhetoric of needing every Conservative to represent their constituents constituents to speak to this specific bill, that would be great too.
Hold on, the honourable member, order. The honourable member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for his good faith question. The reality is, Madam Speaker, that it is the Liberal House Leader who will ultimately make a decision when each of the bills before Parliament is brought to a vote in its negotiation with their coalition partners, the NDP, and the official opposition, the Conservatives. So I came and I spoke in good faith on Bill S6. Many of the regulations related to the Health of Animals Act, on biosecurity, I think are really relevant, and it's a good bill. But ultimately, in terms of its passage, and when we come to a vote on it, will be determined whether or not the Liberal House Leader is willing to work with the official opposition to make sure that bills are properly scrutinized and debated accordingly. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Berthier-Masquinongé.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I find it interesting to talk about voting when we feel like it, and in the same speech, to hear a relatively convincing argument for more efficiency for officials and paperwork. I feel like there's a bit of a contradiction. How does he reconcile that? Does he not think that maybe, yes, indeed, we could move on to the next thing and progress and set an example for our government to improve red tape?
Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon.
Well, c'est exactement, Madame le Président, on doit réduire.
Yes, exactly. We have to reduce regulations where it's necessary and improve regulations that protect our food in Canada. We have a lot of work to do. Sometimes we need to reduce regulation, and other times we need to improve regulation in order to deal with demands of our 21st century economy.
The honourable member for Hamilton Centre.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to just give a recognition to the honourable member from Fraser Valley, who seems to have a certain je ne sais quoi, a certain flair that the honourable member from Le seems to have. And I appreciate that in his delivery of petitions. And now it sounds to me, based on his speech, that he has a newfound passion for an elected Senate, one that is mixed member proportional representation, one that allows for true democracy to happen. And I would love to hear this member talk about ways in which we can make the Senate more accountable beyond the patronage appointments of the past Conservative and Liberal governments. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Mission Fraser Canyon.
Let me just say, equal, elected, effective. The first action I ever took as a Canadian in the democratic process was to put a wonderful Reform Party of Canada sign on my dad's front lawn. And from that day, I learned about how the Senate has underrepresented my province since its inception into Confederation, and that one day, through economic reconciliation with First Nations, we might see British Columbia gain its proper place in this federation, but we can't do it without working with Indigenous Canadians so they can take control of their lives, get the Indian Act out of the way, let them flourish through resource development and partnering with businesses to create a new life and new opportunity for young people, especially young Indigenous peoples across our great country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The honourable member for Mission Matsky Fraser Canyon. I think we're all astonished by the turn this debate has taken on modernizing regulations. I just wanted to express to him some degree of sympathy that the electoral boundary redistribution will deprive him of representing the town of Ashcroft and the extraordinarily vital and engaged citizenry. As well, I think you're losing Lytton, which we already lost and action has not moved. I'm not facetious about losing Lytton. We shall never lose Lytton. It must be rebuilt. But I ask the honourable member, is it inevitable that his boundaries are redrawn in that fashion?
The honourable member for Mission Matsquit Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the good faith question from my colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands. Firstly, during the redistribution process, the member knows the Fraser Canyon and all of those communities have a really special place in my heart, as they do for her. I think Ashcroft is like the Sedona of Canada, and it has such a bright future. And there's so many amazing things going on there, and you cannot find, it's one of the only ecological zones in Canada that is actually a desert. And it is beautiful, and I encourage everyone to visit the village of Ashcroft. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't mention tonight Cache Creek. There's flooding going on in Cache Creek that has increased every year since the 2017 Elephant Hill fire. In fact, since that time, we lost the fire chief to a previous flood, and it just goes to show how much work we have to do on climate mitigation and adaptation for small communities like Cache Creek to give them a future, and so they're not subject to these annual floods which tear apart businesses and homes for people. And yes, my staff will continue working hard to support Lytton. We've made progress. We're working in good faith with all parties. Building permits can be issued now, but we have so much more to do and get done.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député d'Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. With all the enthusiasm of my honourable colleague, I'd like to know if he'd be interested of considering in a reformed Senate the arrival of separatists in the Senate. I'm not saying we'd go there, but I'd be curious to see if he'd be ready to hear that, because it represents a relatively important proportion of Quebecers. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
L'honorable député de Mission Matsquit Fraser Canyon.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The right of every Canadian, even Quebecers who don't believe in Canada, is to vote with their conscience, even for an elected Senate. Thank you.